action. And joining us now for more on this from Washington, the former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund and Bloomberg View columnist, Simon Johnson. He's the co-author of White House Burning, Our National Debt and Why It Matters to You, now out in paperback. Simon, good to see you this morning.
Nice to be with you.
Simon, if you could help us through this over the next week or so, it doesn't look like there's a path to avoiding the sequestration if you listen to the two sides. So how damaging would this be? Because we've heard a couple different versions of it that would have immediate impacts, more than 750,000 jobs lost perhaps. Others say it won't be that bad. What's your view?
I think it's going to be bad. We're going to lose jobs. GDP is going to slow. I don't know if it'll push us back into recession, but the effect on lower income Americans, including children, is really very harsh. Given what's already happening with income inequality in this country in the last couple of years, that this is nasty stuff.
Hey, Simon, can you give us a sense, perhaps, of how quickly these job cuts occur? March 1st happens, sequester starts. Are we looking at one fell swoop very quickly, or is it the drip treatment over a period of months?
It's over a period of months. I'm not sure it's going to feel like a drip, though. I think it's going to be a rolling set of nasty dramas. And remember, we also have the issue of funding the government and the debt ceiling fight coming up again in May. So there's a lot of uncertainty around fiscal policy, around government contracting of all kinds. So it's going to be a sort of rolling snowball effect, I might call it, where it gets bigger and bigger. And by May, this may be the only thing we're talking about.
Richard, one could wonder at this point, what was the point of setting this sequester limit if now we're just figuring out ways to come up with a new deal? This was supposed to be the deal. This was supposed to be the thing that forced action.
Right.
What was the point of it if we're not going to enforce it?
That's a very good question. What was the point of it? The point of it was that people had crawled out on a limb and they needed to come off it somehow. And the very people who crawled out on that limb are now saying, how did we ever get here? You made me do it. I mean, it is ridiculous. And unfortunately, you know, what's that Hillary Clinton line that she used to use? If you do this, the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Just in terms of the politics, and also in terms of the spending and the budget piece of this, this crowd in Washington right now is doing the same thing over and over. And what you're going to have, I'm afraid for Republican friends, is that the politics don't work out well. You just fought on the same territory, and it didn't work out. And now you're going to have this rolling series of furlough letters and news stories saying people are going to lose their jobs. Why haven't they come together? And the history of this doesn't look good in terms of the politics, doesn't look good in terms of the budget, also doesn't look good for people who want to deal with the underlying problems.
But Dan, the president did agree to this. He signed, this was an agreement he came up with Republicans in Congress.
I mean, the absurdity is everyone says, it was your idea. No, it was your idea, you know, is a bit much. But in terms of the impact on the macro economy, I mean, I agree with what Simon said, that the beneficiaries of these individual programs will take a hit, and I'm very concerned about it. Especially the Defense Department, you're talking about $50 billion a year immediately would be a big blow to the defense budget and the beneficiaries of these individual programs on the discretionary side. But in terms of the macroeconomic impact, Simon, and we're talking about like less than 1/4% of GDP. Again, I'm not for all of these cuts, but I'm saying in terms of the macro impact, I mean, that's comparable to the tax increases that the president was for over this past year that were passed. So why are the tax increases not going to be a drain on GDP, but these cuts will be?
Well, I think it's the combination. It's not just the sequestration. It's the other fiscal fights that we've had and that we're going to have. So it's this combination. And uncertainty of this kind is very bad, as you know, for all kinds of business investment and for consumer decisions. That's going to have a knock-on effect on employment. Employers have been very reluctant to take people back on since 2008. So we're compounding those problems in a way that I think is unnecessary and unfortunate.
Jonathan Capehart's got a question. Jonathan?
Hey, Simon, you were at the IMF.
Yes,
right.
he was.
Yeah. So how does the rest of the world look at what's happening here in the United States and how we go from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis, not every couple of years, but seemingly every quarter? Does the rest of the world think that we have become completely dysfunctional?
Yes, although they've known that for some time now. It's remarkable that the U.S. dollar and U.S. government debt is still the primary safe haven. That's where people put their rainy day money. And yet at the same time, I mean, these are sophisticated people around the world, and I'm sure many of them watch your show. They understand fully the kinds of problems that we've created for ourselves. Now, if we continue down this road, and if you bring those two thoughts together, the U.S. dollar is not such a compelling reserve asset. Foreigners are not as willing to buy U.S. Treasury debt in the future at low interest rates. Then we have a much bigger problem coming, and we will have brought that problem on ourselves by behaving in this reckless, irresponsible manner repeatedly over these unnecessary fiscal showdowns.
Simon, different subject. You've written about, as you call it, the convergence of George Will and Sherrod Brown on financial regulatory reform, which I agree with. I think there's been an opportunity for some time, sort of Occupy Wall Street meets the Tea Party, and sort of a joint populist backlash against the big institutions. What do you see in the current environment we're in right now that actually makes that potential increase for some sort of collaboration between, you know, two typically ideological adversaries?
Well, I don't think we're going to see new legislation, but when I talk to officials, for example, around the Fed or the FDIC and some other bodies in Washington, there is increasing skepticism about the very largest banks, how they behave. Too big to manage has increasingly become a mantra. But you just look at the repeated mistakes, HSBC, Standard Chartered, JP Morgan Chase, of course, repeatedly in the last year or so. So some of the biggest, best names on Wall Street have demonstrated that they can't manage themselves. Citigroup, repeatedly. And I would say going forward, absolutely, Citigroup's going to be the center of many of our problems. When you look at that and you think how little benefit we get from the size and the complexity of the institutions, increasingly people on the right, like George Will, and people on the left, like Sherrod Brown, are saying, let's walk this back. Let's find some reasonable ways, put more equity into the system, let's have a lot more capital behind all balance sheets in the financial system, and let's limit the size, limit the risks that some of these mega banks can take, limit the downside damage they can do to the rest of us.
Simon, speaking of risk, how would you say, where have we come from the financial crisis to now in terms of the level of risk that the largest banks are taking? Have they reined it in a little bit, or do you think there's still things to be alarmed about? For example, like the huge loss that JP Morgan took last year, which was you know, a risk management vacation. Have we made any progress?
A little bit of progress has been made. Dodd-Frank had some steps in the right direction. Certainly, you know, the bank executives were scared, and they're currently being more careful. But when you look at the structure of the issue, when you look at the incentives they have, Jeremy Stein, who's a governor of the Federal Reserve now, gave a very good speech on this a couple of weeks ago. He said, look at the incentive problems within big banks managing particularly investments in debt and in derivatives. These problems are still with us, and regulation by itself, just saying, oh, we'll have smarter regulation, that's not going to work. You need a more decisive cap on the damage that these banks can bring to the economy. This is a point that John Huntsman did make effectively in the Republican primaries last time around. Didn't get the broader traction. George Will is picking it up. Other people on the right and the left, Sherrod Brown, Elizabeth Warren, are also articulating not what I would call populism. I would call it responsible, smart, sensible economics. That's finally confronting a problem that's brought us enormous damage.
Simon, before I let you go, I want to point out in the title of your book, White House Burning, Our National Debt and Why It Matters to You. It's a conversation we've been having a lot around this table, whether or not the debt matters today or sometime down the road in the future. And I think your question or your statement in that title is one that should be answered, because I don't think most Americans understand in the now and the here why debt matters to them. What's the short answer to that question for the average American, why they should be concerned or perhaps not concerned about the government debt?
Well, you should be concerned that looking out 20 or 30 years, we bring the debt under control. And in our book, we make some, in our view, middle-of-the-road, responsible suggestions for doing that. But you shouldn't be panicked. Don't force yourself into precipitate action. Don't do things that damage the economy, like, for example, the sequester. That's not what you need in order to regard the debt, bring the debt under control, regard it as a serious issue, which we do. Sequester, under these circumstances, to be avoided.
So do you believe, as, say, Paul Krugman believes, that the time is to invest more government money into the economy?
Well, I would continue with the sensible long-term investment programs that we have in this country, and I think there are some additional needs around infrastructure, and certainly investing in children's health and in children's education. I think those are terrific and important priorities, although they're not entirely federal. There's also state and local responsibilities there. I think that the main issue, though, is don't damage the economy. Don't have these repeated fiscal fights, which are not for good reason and are not necessary to get the debt onto a responsible trajectory.